The note was folded in half, tucked inside a ceramic mug at the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one my husband never touches because he's 6 feet tall and doesn't need to reach up. Our handyman, Roy, had been fired 3 days earlier. My husband said he'd been overstepping. I didn't ask what that meant. I should have. I stood on the step stool with a dish towel in my hand, reaching for the mugs to wash them because apparently that was my life now, cleaning a house that had started to feel like it belonged to a stranger. The folded paper fell out and landed on the counter. I almost threw it away without reading it. Almost. Your husband isn't who you think he is. Check the storage unit on Merchant Street, Unit 14. The combination is the year you got married. I'm sorry I can't say more. Roy. My heartbeat dropped somewhere into my stomach. I read it 3 more times. Then I set the mug down very carefully because my hands had started to shake and I didn't trust myself not to drop it. Roy had worked for us for 2 years. He'd fixed our leaking basement pipe, repainted the garage, replaced the rotting deck boards 1 plank at a time through a hot August. My husband, Marcus, had fired him on a Tuesday morning with 2 weeks severance and a reason that kept changing. First it was attitude problems, then it was showing up late. Then it just wasn't working out. I felt bad about it in that vague way you feel bad when something happens in your own house and you have no idea how it started. Now I was wondering if Roy had been fired not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of something he'd seen. Merchant Street was 12 minutes from our house. I'd driven past that row of storage units 100 times without thinking twice. Marcus had rented Unit 14 about a year and a half ago. He told me he needed somewhere to store his construction equipment since our garage was full. He was a contractor. It made sense. I hadn't questioned it. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after reading Roy's note. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. My coffee went cold. I kept thinking, what do I actually know about my husband? Not what he's told me. What I actually know about my husband. Not what he's told me. What I actually know. We'd been married for 4 years. We'd met at a mutual friend's wedding, which felt very meet-cute at the time. He was charming and decisive and made me feel seen in a way nobody had before. We bought the house in Raleigh 8 months after the wedding. I worked remotely doing UX design. He ran his own contracting business. We didn't have kids yet, though we'd talked about it. Life had seemed from the outside perfectly ordinary, but there were things that had been bothering me that I kept smoothing over in my mind. The way he sometimes came home hours later than expected without explanation. The way he'd taken to locking his home office, which hadn't always been locked. The way he'd fired Roy so abruptly when Roy had never been anything but professional. The way, now that I was sitting here with a handwritten warning in my hands, all those small wrongnesses were lining up into something that looked much bigger than the sum of its parts. I decided not to go to the storage unit that day. Not because I wasn't terrified. I was. But I'd watched enough real crime stories to know that when something is hidden, the way you uncover it matters. If I went immediately and Marcus found out I'd been there, I'd lose the element of surprise. I'd lose whatever leverage came with knowing something he didn't know I knew. So I folded Roy's note back up, tucked it inside a tampon box under the bathroom sink, the one place I was statistically certain my husband would never look, and I went back to my workday like nothing had happened. That evening, Marcus came home at 6:30. He kissed me on the cheek. He asked what I wanted for dinner. He told me about a client meeting that had run long. He was warm and easy and completely normal, and I sat across from him at our kitchen island eating takeout Thai food and watching his hands and thinking, what is in Unit 14? I didn't sleep. I lay beside him in the dark listening to him breathe and running through every possible explanation. The logical ones first. Old business documents, equipment he didn't want to transport, something boring and tax-related. But Roy had specifically written your husband isn't who you think he is. That wasn't the warning you leave when someone has a storage unit full of old invoices. By 3 in the morning, I'd made a decision. I was going. But I was going smart. The next day, Marcus left at 7:30 for a job site in Cary. I waited until 8, confirmed his truck was gone, then got in my car. The storage facility on Merchant Street was one of those anonymous places with a keypad gate and rows of orange roll-up doors. I found a parking spot away from the main cameras, pulled up the hood of my jacket, and walked to Unit 14. My hands were shaking so badly I had to enter the combination twice. The year we got married. It opened on the second try. The door rolled up. I stood there for a moment before I could process what I was seeing. It wasn't construction equipment. The unit was roughly the size of a one-car garage. Along the left wall was a folding table with a laptop, a small printer, and stacks of manila folders. Along the right wall were plastic bins, labeled in Marcus's handwriting, and on the back wall, thumb-tacked directly onto the drywall, were papers, documents, what looked like contracts, and photographs of women, different women, 5 of them that I counted, each with a name written beneath in black marker, each with what appeared to be financial documents attached by paperclip. I stepped closer. My vision narrowed. The photographs were professional headshots or social media photos, the kind you could pull from LinkedIn or Facebook. Each had an age, a location, an occupation. Each had a column of notes beside it. One of the women had been checked off. Her name was circled, and beneath the circle, in Marcus's handwriting, settled. March. I picked up the nearest folder with hands that had stopped shaking because fear had gone so far past shaking that it landed somewhere cold and very, very still. Inside were documents that looked like loan agreements, private loan agreements, not from a bank, but from Marcus himself as an individual lender. Each one was for a sum between $40,000 and $120,000. The interest rates were predatory, the kind you'd see on a payday loan, not a personal contract between acquaintances. And the signatures on the borrower lines? I pulled out my phone and photographed every page before I let myself keep reading. The signatures looked off. Not forged exactly, more like signed under duress, or signed without fully understanding what was being agreed to. There was a folder with my name on it. I almost couldn't open it. Inside was a copy of our marriage certificate, a copy of my freelance contracts, documents I'd never shown Marcus, and a hand-drawn timeline. The timeline started with the date we met and had notes at each stage. Introduced via Leah, confirmed income tier, lease ending, apartment vulnerable, and then our wedding date, and after it a single line that made my vision go white for a second, life insurance policy, beneficiary updated, October. October was 6 months ago. I stood in that storage unit for 23 minutes. I photographed everything, every document, every folder, every name on that back wall, every note in Marcus's handwriting. I moved nothing. I left everything exactly as I'd found it. I rolled the door down. I reset the combination lock with hands that had finally stopped working properly, so I had to try 3 times. Then I got in my car and I drove to a Panera parking lot 2 miles away and sat there for a long time before I trusted myself to move. I didn't go home. I couldn't go home yet, not without putting on a face I wasn't sure I could manage. What I'd seen wasn't infidelity. It wasn't some sad secret I could cry about and then decide what to do with my feelings. What I'd seen was a system, a methodology. Marcus had a type. Women in financial transition, women who were vulnerable in specific, documentable ways, and he had a process for moving through them. I didn't fully understand the mechanics of it yet, but I knew enough to know it was criminal, and I knew that the folder with my name on it had a life insurance timeline in it, and that I needed to be very careful. I called my sister from the Panera parking lot, not to tell her everything, not on the phone, not yet. I just asked if I could come stay with her for a few days, told her I needed some space, kept my voice steady. She said, of course. She didn't ask follow-up questions, which is one of the things I love most about her. That afternoon, while Marcus was still on the job site, I went home and packed 1 bag. Just clothes, my laptop, my passport, my social security card, and a small external hard drive I used for work backups. I transferred all the photos from my phone to the hard drive. I drove to my sister's apartment in Durham. I didn't tell Marcus I was leaving. I texted him that evening, staying at Nicole's for a few days. Need some space. Will explain when I'm ready. He called 3 times. I let it go to voicemail. His messages were exactly what I would have expected from a man who didn't yet know he'd been caught. Confused, gentle, slightly hurt, asking what was wrong, telling me he loved me. At my sister's kitchen table that night, I spread out everything I remembered and started organizing it in a document, every detail I could recall, every name on that wall, every date on the timeline. Then I called a friend of a friend who'd gone through a difficult divorce and asked who she'd used. She texted me a name within minutes. The attorney, a woman named Helen, had 20 years of family and financial law. I met with her the following morning. I showed her the photographs on my hard drive. I watched her expression change. Not dramatically, she was a professional. But I saw it, the subtle tightening, The way she sat forward, she told me several things. First, that what I was describing had characteristics of a scheme called predatory lending fraud, potentially combined with insurance fraud, depending on what more investigation uncovered. Second, that because I was a named subject in his documents with an insurance timeline, I should not return to the house alone. Third, that there were several appropriate next steps and that we needed to take them in the right order. I also called my insurance agent that week and asked some questions I framed as general curiosity. What I found out confirmed what I feared. Marcus had taken out a $250,000 policy on my life 14 months ago, with himself as sole beneficiary. I had not signed those documents. Or rather, someone had signed them. It wasn't my signature. Everything moved faster after that. My attorney made a referral to a financial crimes attorney who worked alongside law enforcement. I gave them everything. The full set of photographs, the folders, the timeline, the names of the other women. One of those women, when investigators reached out, had already filed a complaint about a predatory loan she couldn't get out of. Another had moved out of state following what she described as escalating pressure and threats. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been running variations of the same scheme across multiple victims for at least 5 years, and who had married me not because of anything I was but because of what I represented on paper: a documented income, an independent professional reputation, a social circle that wouldn't ask too many questions, and an absence of family nearby to intervene. Roy had figured it out while replacing some shelving in Marcus's home office. He'd seen documents he wasn't meant to see. When he'd asked about them, trying, I think, to give Marcus the chance to explain, Marcus had fired him the same day. Roy had known he couldn't go to the police without documentation. He'd known I was the one who needed to know, so he'd hidden the note in a mug he knew I used and waited for me to find it. I found Roy through the number on his old invoices. I called him from a coffee shop and told him I'd found the note. He went very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was hoping you would." He'd been worried about me for months, he said. He'd debated what to do. He was sorry it had taken him so long to act. I told him that note might have saved my life. I meant it literally. Marcus was arrested on a Thursday morning. I was at my sister's apartment when my attorney called to tell me. Federal agents and local law enforcement. Charges including wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, and insurance fraud. His attorney immediately pushed for bail, and initially they were inclined to grant it, which sent a cold spike through me. But then the investigators reviewed the insurance documents with the forged signature, and the bail was revoked. My sister sat with me on her couch and held my hand while I stared at nothing and tried to absorb the fact that my marriage had been a financial crime from the beginning. There is a particular kind of grief that has no name I know of, the grief of losing something you realize you never actually had. The marriage I mourned wasn't the real marriage. The man I mourned wasn't the real man. What I was left with was a hollowed-out space where a life had been, and the knowledge that I'd been watched and assessed and selected the way you select an asset. But I was also left with something else. I'd found the note. I'd gone to the unit. I'd kept my head when every nerve in my body was screaming. I documented everything before I touched anything. I'd consulted an attorney before I'd confronted him. I'd protected myself. The divorce petition was filed 3 weeks after his arrest. It was, my attorney told me, fairly uncomplicated given the circumstances. The house went on the market. The life insurance policy was canceled and the fraud referred to the state insurance commissioner. I cooperated with every part of the federal investigation. Roy came to my sister's apartment once, about 6 weeks after the arrest. He brought a coffee cake from a bakery near his house and sat at the kitchen table, and we talked for 2 hours. He was a quiet man, careful with words. He told me he'd almost not left the note, that he talked himself out of it twice because he didn't think it was his place. I asked him what made him finally do it. He thought about it for a while. "You were always kind to me," he said. "And kindness like that, it seemed like a waste to just let it get destroyed. I'm not in that house anymore. I'm in a smaller apartment near my sister, which is not what I pictured for my mid-30s, but there are worse things to be. I work. I take long walks. I talk to a therapist every other week, a woman who is extraordinarily good at sitting with complicated feelings without trying to simplify them. I've started cooking again, which I'd stopped doing during the marriage without ever noticing. And occasionally, when I'm having a hard day and the hollowness gets loud, I think about the mug cabinet above the refrigerator, about the folded note falling onto the counter, about the version of me who almost threw it away without reading it. I'm glad she didn't. I'm glad she stood on that step stool and reached all the way to the back. There's a version of that morning where I throw the note away, where I'm in too much of a hurry, or too tired, or too trusting. And I toss it without unfolding it, and I go on with my day, and I never know. I think about that version sometimes. It doesn't feel far away. It feels like it was one distracted moment from being real. What stopped it from being real wasn't luck. It was something Roy built over 2 years of showing up quietly and paying attention. He noticed things were wrong before I did. He saw documents he wasn't meant to see, and instead of deciding it wasn't his problem, he made a choice that cost him his job and could have cost him more than that. That's not a small thing. That's a person with a moral center and tact enough to act on it, even when acting was inconvenient and risky, and nobody would have blamed him for staying out of it. I think about that a lot, how much of what we call luck is actually just other people's decency arriving exactly when we need it. And then there's what I had to do with it. Finding the note was the easy part. What came next required something different, something I didn't know I had until I needed it. I had to read a warning about my own husband and not fall apart. I had to walk into a storage unit alone and photograph evidence with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I had to sit across from Marcus at dinner that night and act normal when nothing in my life was normal anymore. I had to think clearly under the kind of pressure that makes most people's thinking go sideways. None of that happened automatically. It happened because I made a series of deliberate decisions. Don't react, document. Protect yourself before you confront. That kind of thinking, the kind that doesn't abandon you when you're terrified, isn't something you either have or you don't. It's something you build, slowly, by trusting your own judgment over and over in smaller situations, until it's there for you in the big one. The hardest part was the grief, not the fear, not the logistics, the grief. Understanding that the marriage I'd been living inside was a structure someone had built around me on purpose, that I had been selected, assessed, and placed. Sitting with that without letting it turn me into someone who couldn't function or couldn't affrontion or couldn't trust or couldn't eventually be okay. That took a different kind of strength. Not toughness exactly. More like the willingness to feel the full weight of something terrible and keep moving anyway. To go to therapy and say the true thing out loud even when the true thing was humiliating. To let my sister sit with me without pretending I was fine. To rebuild slowly, without rushing the timeline, without performing recovery before it was real. What Marcus counted on was that I wouldn't look too closely, that the life he'd constructed would be comfortable enough and I would be trusting enough and nobody would leave a note in a coffee mug. He was wrong on the last count, and that changed everything. But I also had to be the person who unfolded the paper, who drove to Merchant Street, who called an attorney before she called him back. The outcome wasn't handed to me. I had to be ready to receive it. Roy told me kindness like mine seemed like a waste to let get destroyed. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. I think what he meant, and what I've come to believe, is that how you treat people in ordinary moments determines who shows up for you in the extraordinary ones. You can't calculate that. You can't manufacture it. You just have to be decent, consistently, for no reason other than that it's the right way to move through the world. And sometimes, on a completely ordinary Tuesday, it comes back to you, folded in half inside a coffee mug, and it saves your life.